Ṣẹ̀kẹ̀rẹ̀ lọ bá jó, ṣẹ̀kẹ̀rẹ̀ lọ bá jó, olúwa mi ò dìde ojó
The Ashen Forge. The Ashen Forge.
Hello, and welcome to the Ashen Forge. I am Phantom X, joined as always by Diggs and the legendary Neurotoxin. How are y'all doing?
Great.
Well, we have had an AMA on Friday that we get to now go over. I guess before we get to that, we've been kind of talking about anything. Diggs, you've been playing Lord of the Rings with me.
Kind of, yes.
With me is a little bit of a stretch, kind of asynchronously.
Yes, we should fix that. I have 2 characters to level 20 now, so I think I'm ready to actually join you rather than just sending you stuff by email, and we should probably have a show about that at some point. I was just saying how talking about the AMA, that just happened Friday, I think, with Steven. I'm expecting significant changes because we have no release date. So they're not on a schedule to try and get things out quickly, which means they have time to change stuff if they want to change it. And we also don't have a lead game designer. And I was looking at the intro just now and going, man, new people are going to be like, who's that guy, that third person in all those images with Stephen and Margaret? Like, who is he? I've never seen him because it's been a year without a lead game designer, I think. So,
yeah. I've thought about that with Jeffrey being in all of the opening stuff, whether it's time to put something new in or not. I just don't want to bother with
I just hadn't paid too much attention, but yeah. Well, we don't need to until we get a new lead game designer, I would think. So,
well, any general thoughts before we kind of dive into some of these questions?
Do they still even have a listing that they're looking for a lead game designer?
I assume everybody knows they're looking for a lead game designer, but I don't know.
I will look while we talk.
Yeah. So it was kind of an interesting sort of thing. It was the 20 most upvoted questions out of 50. What they're going to do with the other 30, I don't know. But 20 of them were answered, some to a greater extent, some were a little shorter answers.
I thought it was a little amusing how many times Steven said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to be coughing so much," or "I'm sorry, I'm coughing." He coughs every for the last, I don't know, 6 months. He's been coughing a bunch.
There was
constantly,
a point.
So I don't know why he's acting like he doesn't cough.
Like some point where he hadn't been coughing, and then all of a sudden there's a point where he started coughing and hasn't seemed to fully stop. In fact, I was sitting there in chat about to say, man, you're sounding so much better. No coughs or anything. And then the moment I was like right about to press enter was the first coughs. Oh, poor guy. So not been able to get enough time to rest and recover from this one, whatever it is.
We hope you're okay, Steven. We've noticed that over the last, 3-4 live streams. So
it's been longer than that. I just assume he's going to be coughing. I mean, it's been months, but that's fine.
I hope it's just something like stupid and silly, like one of the air filters just has to get replaced because it got moldy and got forgotten or something.
Could be allergies. I don't know.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, some good information. I felt like a lot of it was just sort of not as climatic as some of their live streams have been. Although we've had such a series of good stuff with the character creator and weather and all of these things. I think it's kind of hard to get past the expectations now. But
yeah, it wasn't going to be showing us anything. Although, we got a couple of little tiny
Things were
leaks.
definitely revealed. Oh man, the whole thing about crafting, like that was, oh, have we even said all of this stuff? Well, we're gonna do it now.
Well, but again, when are we going to get Alpha 2? And when are we going to get to see this stuff that he's talking about? And what's going to happen if they get a lead game designer?
Yeah.
Who knows? He can say all kinds of stuff. This is, again, where we're at a place of show, don't tell.
Well, yeah, Neil Nelson in chat. I hope it's coming in. I'm not so sure it was. He kind of danced around that question as much as he could when you go back and really look through the transcript. I did find it interesting that they're going to start doing some spot testing. That's under NDA as well, which we've talked about that in the past. How much we wondered if some of the troubles they had back in Alpha 1. Like, gosh, I wish I had never announced that we would have all open non-NDA sessions, because I think at times want to be able to go back under their hood and be like, okay, we're going to put our head down, not let people stream this, try to work through it, which seems to be what their probably approach is going to be with Alpha 2, because I assume these spot tests are going to be on brand new systems.
Yeah, and he said they're going to be very much directed and curated towards like a specific thing they're trying to work out. These aren't, here's the world, play it and let us know. It's, all right, we need everybody to go here and do this thing or try this specific thing anywhere you can in the world, but that's the thing you're focused on. So that's what the spot testing is going to be. If anybody's thinking, all right, sign that NDA and get into some spot tests, it's going to be fun. Well, it might be enjoyable, but ultimately what you're trying to do is help them work things out. And so if you're coming just for kicks, it's whatever. It's, really, if you're going to be doing that sort of thing and you're given the opportunity, you should be coming at it with a critical lens. They want the feedback. If something's cool, let them know. Let them know why. If something sucks, let them know. Let them know why. Those things are important.
A few weeks ago in the forums, there was a little discussion about spot testing. It's interesting because on Discord, we still have a channel for Alpha 1 spot testing. And I was telling people, well, that ship is kind of sailed because, they've bumped up to UE5. They've bumped up to UE5 now. It's not the same environment as Alpha 1. So it's going to have to be some kind of Alpha 2 or pre-Alpha 2 spot testing. That's number one. Two, someone was saying, well, they could be doing stuff and we just don't know it. And I'm like, they're doing stuff with the what's the top tier group that gets to, is it Vanguard? It's not Vanguard.
Yeah,
what's
the Phoenix Initiative?
Phoenix, yeah. Phoenix Initiative might be doing some spot testing that we don't know about. But I'm pretty sure that once they do start spot testing, they're going to tell us, hey, we're about to do some spot testing. I think they're going to talk about it just like they did prior to Alpha 1. We had some spot tests. I think that's going to be a thing.
That's likely, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to keep that secret.
It seems like that's kind of their thing, because they want to be able to talk about things even if they aren't going to talk about the details of it. Being able to say we're doing spot testing and knowing that some people in the community are actually doing that spot testing, I think is a lot more than just saying, oh well, maybe we're doing spot testing, maybe we're not, but everyone's under NDA and nobody's allowed to talk about it, and like being really, really restrictive like that.
Yeah, I think every other time, even all the Alpha Zeros that we've done, we weren't necessarily invited, but we knew that they were going on. So I think we'll know. I don't think that part will be a secret.
Stephen has always said, because we asked him this back when he was last here, or it might have been the first interview, when we're crafting being, and he's kind of consistently said crafting will be that benchmark that makes Alpha 2. So that's something they want, to be ready to go in Alpha 2, which makes me actually think testing actual Alpha 2 is not going to be for first quarter, second quarter next year. They certainly, I don't think, would do it on the holidays. But when and part of what makes me think this is he's just now starts talking about active crafting. That's a system I am positive they're going to want to make sure is fairly well thought out, fairly well received before they go to a non-NDA Alpha 2, when people look at it and if it's just a horrible piece of trash, are like, what are we doing here? And that just causes more problems than anything. So I have a feeling one of two things or both will happen. One is that these Alpha 2 spot testing might actually start much sooner than what we know, because they might just not tell anyone. And two, that Alpha 2 is still going to be a little ways away before we get our hands on it. So
yeah, and so that's part of what I was saying we should be expecting as our to herald that Alpha 2 is coming up, because for Alpha 1 we started some spot testing for that probably at least 3 or 4 months before it actually opened. I think we started that in like November, December, maybe December of, I want to say 2020. And then we did a bunch for about 4 or 5 months maybe. And then Alpha started in April, May or something like that of 2021. So I'm expecting something similar. Like we'll probably have at least November, December of spot testing. And I don't think Alpha 2 can start before next year. But
he was even, we could get into the questions here in a little bit, but there was, I think, even a question on classes, which got conveniently danced around with the answer essentially being, well, as we create one class, that kind of helps create the next class, because we have certain, basic, principles in place that we can apply without actually answering, the 8 different archetypes. Are they all going to be in? Are there going to actually be classes within those? Makes me start wondering, will there be like an Alpha 3?
I was wondering that too.
We just seem to have, if we take the natural alpha beta release schedule rather than early release, like our early access, like we see, really that beta, you want all of those things in, right? That's your time for testing for major bugs and stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah. And how many versions of Alpha 0 did we have? That we got all kinds of changes to this. Is supposed to be Alpha 1, and then it became Alpha 0, and then it became something else, and then Apocalypse, and then all kinds of stuff. So who knows what the labels will be? I don't think they can put an Alpha 1 anything on there, because again, the environment is so different. But yeah, they could add a Alpha 3 surprise.
They can just do Alpha 2 Part 2 if they want, and the Alpha 2 Part 3.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a question, though, if they're planning to have, because it sounds like they want to run Alpha 2 for a while to really get like systems a good run through all the combat and crafting and economy and loading, dynamic events and world events and all that sort of fun stuff. And so it's probably going to be a long one. And so I wonder if the plan is actually going to be like an open development-y sort of thing for a moment, where we've got enough of these things close enough, and we're going to do the Alpha 2. And during Alpha 2, we're going to release the rest of the stuff that we needed to get in while people are going through all the stuff we currently have. And then once we're kind of satisfied with where things are at, we're going to close down the Alpha 2 and do spot testing up to Beta 1 for all the remaining systems and features and presentation.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to have a kind of, whoops, this isn't quite Alpha 2 kind of thing, or, this is what would have been Alpha 2, but Alpha 3 is going to be the real Alpha 2. That's going to be what we see. I don't know what the labels for all that is going to be.
Well, here, we're dancing around some of this. So question number 2 of this was, what work or milestones still need to be completed before Alpha 2's launch? His answer was, when we think about how Alpha 2 kind of steps further, a lot of that is putting in content for the core mechanics, adding additional classes, ability systems, adding content to quest systems, events, adding aspects to the naval systems, professions, gatherings, artisan ships, essentially saying Alpha 1 contained a lot of their basic systems. But when I see that answer, I mean, we didn't have crafting in Alpha 1. We didn't have nodes in Alpha 1. We didn't have any naval stuff in Alpha 1.
We had basic crafting. We had insultingly basic crafting. Like not it they had enough to show that you could gather and convert and make things out of resources. By and large, it was a lot of broken a lot of the time. So, you know, you could try doing a little of this and that with it, but there were some limitations. And then I feel like later on it got even more broke in some ways, or they enabled you to do some things you couldn't before, but it still didn't work. So, yeah, I wouldn't say Alpha 1 was a good representation of anything craft related. Harvesting, sure, and maybe some of the processing.
That reminds me of the spaghetti that my grandma used to make, which wasn't spaghetti to me. What she made was a nice pasta, but it didn't fill what I needed for spaghetti. I mean, it wasn't real spaghetti. But I mean, yeah, you know, technically they had ingredients there, probably through UE4. It probably comes with some basic crafting stuff that you can do, but it wasn't the real crafting system that they're hoping for.
You know, the other thing,
I would say there's not crafting.
You know, he commented a lot on the successes, which I think is positive. And he mentioned a lot on networking and not having lag. But, you know, now we have the weather system and all these other things in place that, I don't know. I just, you know, I'm curious how long Alpha 2 goes, what other issues we run into as we introduce all these other new systems, that all the data that's going to be coming back and forth this whole time, server to PC. But we'll see. Hopefully
that's
soon.
why they got to test these things.
Yeah. Well, we can just go through some of the questions. I know I had a few that I was really interested in. I just want to say to all of my fellow Ashes of Creation players that we had a chance to interview Steven. Well, kind of asynchronously interview Steven. Now I recognize he was not going to answer many of the questions we might want answered, but for the number one upvoted answer or question to be about server merges drives me nuts. Like, of all the things we could have had as the number one question, server merging was the number one. But it's a, I guess, interesting question nonetheless. So
it's an interesting question, and I can understand a lot of people's concern, because I think a lot of veterans are used to having their servers merge with other servers over time, whether being the quote strong server or quote weak server, or in some games where such things are completely arbitrary, and the only real difference is whose economy is the one that kind of shows up in the marketplace over the next month or two. Other than that, you know, it's a sort of thing where I can understand if there's such a big ruling on, you know, how limited certain things are, and, you know, a legendary weapon, you're not just gonna obtain that on a character and then do a server transfer with that character holding this legendary weapon that you took from a different server. So I understand how some of the rules that have been put in place about not being able to take things from one server to another will give people pause about, do I want to get invested knowing that everything I've built up on a server might get wiped away because I picked the wrong one, because it's not a sandbox or a theme park, rather, like WoW, where nobody actually, like vanilla WoW in particular, nobody actually owns anything. It's all NPC controlled lands. It's just, you know, all the little events of the theme park that you want to, you know, pay the tickets and do the rides and stuff. This isn't that. The state of the world itself is part of the content and part of how the game is being played. So, you know, if you've done all this stuff to build up and be, you know, a big fish in a small pond, it sucks for that to go all the way down the drain when they, you know, just flush the server. So I can understand then why that would be a big concern. I haven't looked at the dates, but I'm guessing that might have also been one of the first questions that was asked. Additionally, there's a potential that a big name person, I won't name any of them, but there are many that are following the game, might have brought it up on one of their shows and that also helped get it, some upvotes and promotion. It's not a bad question to be the first one. I can see how it's like there's so many other things we would want to know, but I want to sit down and play this game and know I'm not going to lose everything because there aren't enough people I'm playing with on the server. That is definitely a valid concern.
Well, I think the other thing, it's interesting the way he answered the question, because not just housing might be an issue, nodes might be an issue, but property and even quests. I mean, items, and even quests that have been completed, achievements might be very different, right? The servers might have evolved differently, so people could have achievements that they, even on a weak server, achieved that never happened in the history of the stronger server. So they might have items from world bosses that never appeared on the other one. So that's the challenge in my mind. But I think I did see something, one of the responses you made, I don't know which one, talked about how it would be nice to have an apocalypse of the whatever, I guess that would be the weaker world.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping for that to have it destroyed, and then people are reborn on this other world. And
I can give the summary of that one real quick. The idea would be the weaker server, things kind of go to crap in a lot of places. Players are slowly kind of pushed back by the corruption and condensed into certain locations, possibly the portal locations. That would be thematic. And maybe any other points of interest that have been taken up. And then what happens is the apocalypse occurs. Everything that wasn't covered in corruption is wiped away. You've already been caravanning your stuff further back and further back, trying to preserve it through all of this. Meanwhile, on the strong server, some wild event occurs that forces corruption to manifest in a lot of the areas that essentially the weak server is going to bring over. So what happens is when the apocalypse finishes on the weak server, the strong server essentially takes in all of the important nodes that were then, wiped off. And obviously this is going to require everything to work within certain configurations and parameters, so you don't accidentally have two metropolis right next to each other, or something where you have things of too high an influence and magnitude and too close of proximity. They would probably need to have like it really kind of pick and choose, and maybe even de-level some areas as part of the strong server event, just to make sure that there's room to bring everything in properly from the weak server. But that would be the idea, is that you have a thematic event that brings the two together, rather than it just being, oh, well, this server sucks, so here's a bag with all of your stuff, and you can kind of, go to any major city and claim it, and good luck out there, squirt.
The land part is what gets me the most. I know he said there's sort of two. Well, one option is that you just start over, and the other is that this weak server just gets screwed, basically. I feel like starting over, especially since real estate is going to be, has been talked about as something that's active and will be pursued by people. I feel like it'd be very unfair, but we'll see. That is a long ways. As Woodchip said, a wasted answer at this point, and I agree. I think I did I type that in Discord? I don't remember. Like, I finally sat down to watch. And I was like, this is their first question? Really?
Well, the other thing that it's interesting the way he phrased it. He was like, yeah, and the weaker people on the weaker server will have a chance to change their names if they need to, because like, oh, that's really going to go over well. Theorioff was saying how in chat how EQ2, there's a lot of hostility of the server coming in, and yeah, I can imagine if you have to change your name, especially if you're RPer or maybe even a PvEer, you're a crafter, and you have a reputation around your name. That could be interesting. But okay.
I think a better way to do it would be the way they did it in PlanetSide 1, which is, and it might be a priority sort of thing that you can set ahead of time, like this is your most reserved of names ever, and you can always keep that sort of thing. But other than that, the idea was that when a server would merge, both people would get a dash and the initial for the server at the end of their name. Now, the first one to change their name got to keep the original, and then the other one, you've still got the dash and the initial for the other one. So you still got that name, and they'll know that, like, oh, you're not you're not the one from the server with the S on it. You're from the server from the J on it that merged in. So you're
from Earth 2. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, not Earth 2. It's Earth 1 and Earth A. Get it right. Nobody is Earth 2.
All right. Well, let's keep moving on. My big interest is, I'm going to skip around a little bit, is crafting. So, of course, we finally got two big pieces of information. One was the final list of what the actual professions will be within the artisan trees. And I can quickly go over those, although I'm guessing most people know what they are. But if you're on YouTube and you don't, so, of course, we have gathering, processing, and crafting as sort of the three main artisan branches. So within gathering, there is mining, lumberjacking, herbalism, fishing, and hunting. And that's would be considered gathering. Processing is metalworking, stonemasonry, weaving, tanning, lumber milling, farming, animal husbandry, alchemy, and cooking. And in the crafting category is carpentry, arcane engineering, which I'm very curious about, armor smithing, leatherworking, tailoring, jewel cutting, and scribing. So those are our current, at least.
But it's, well, I mean, I don't know how you would necessarily put cooking in the last one, but it seems like many of them are in two categories. Like you gather some stuff and then you weave and then you tailor. And here, do we have farming? Did they mention farming?
That's in processing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm happy with that part. I'll talk about that later.
Yeah. And then, so you can gather stuff and then cook it.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like there's, as opposed to tailoring or smithing, there's nothing after that. And in some ways that's a logical thing, but in another way, balance-wise, it seems off a little bit to me.
Well, I'm going to say this. It could be that instead of there needing to be a third for cooking, that it's just another layer to the cooking process. It's like, okay, now I've got my baked potatoes and I've got my bacon and I've got, these other things. And now the next tier of cooking, instead of eating these things individually, is making it into quiche of some kind. And then now I've got a much bigger item. Now I can use this to feed my entire party at once. I use this as an item. Everyone comes over and presses the use button. Everybody gets a slice of quiche. Great. I could see that as being how it works, instead of being cooking and then restauranteering or whatever. It's cooking and also cooking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a thread on that. As the idea of cooking being processing rather than crafting. But the way I sort of responded to that was, well, I guess in my mind, then crafting would be actually setting out a meal for people, and processing would be making the individual pieces to that meal. Is sort of how I sort of would view that. I'm really happy with this change. I've talked all along about having a freehold and a farm and animal husbandry and that sort of stuff, and I was kind of worried about, do they separate? Because you can kind of look at farming as gathering versus processing. If you're putting, taking the corn that you gathered, processing it into a corn meal, and then the concern of cooking also then being a crafting profession, essentially, since we can really only focus on one of those branches. So seeing really everything within one artisan branch that relates to farming, farming, cooking, animal husbandry, I'm pretty happy with. I think that gives me more opportunity to do what I want without having to rely on alts, basically.
That is kind of what you're doing in Lord of the Rings Online, right? You have farming and cooking. You're doing in your
that's
whatever
my main
profession
character.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
No,
So
I
that's
certainly hope Ashes of Creation farming is much more involved. I mean, Lord of the Rings is fine; it's fun, but I'm looking for something much, much more involved than what we get there. The cooking is, we should do a show on Lord of the Rings, because the cooking aspect is actually really fun. Traditionally within games, you sort of level out of ingredients. You know what I mean? Like, so you start, okay, I have apples at the 10 to 12, 20 range. And then from 20 to 30, I move to blueberries, and you really never come back to the previous ingredients. But in Lord of the Rings Online, you're actually using not just the individual components, but actually byproducts that you have made. So I could have made blackberry jelly back at the artisan tier, and then 5 tiers later, I have a recipe that needs that artisan jelly from that I made way back when. So you actually have a need for all these things consistently through the process, which is, I think, actually a pretty well designed process. It keeps the economy, I think, active at all levels. It keeps people out in the world at all levels. So.
Yeah, and again, maybe that's kind of what I mean, it's just entering my mind now, so I haven't thought about this previously, but just when I'm hearing the balance, or what I perceive as a possible imbalance, that's what I was kind of thinking too. Maybe you use some of those lower tier cooking stuff in a crafting way as a chef or something like that for meals. But yeah.
Yeah, and AOC Crafter had mentioned this on one of the video that I posted to YouTube, that they're lumping taming in with animal husbandry. I guess I can see why maybe you wouldn't have them together. I can see why you would. I would, yeah, that is kind of strange. Actually, now I'm processing it through my head as I'm talking. And I guess I would see a taming more as going out into the wild to grab a wild animal. But I think you could also do the same with breeding horses, right? If you bred horses, you'd still have to tame them afterwards.
Yeah, I see them as kind of one and the same. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say like, I wouldn't go to somebody who does animal taming and be like, how do you catch a horse? I'd be like, somebody catches it for me. I can understand why there would be a separation of those roles, and I could see even on top of that, part of where taming feeds into the husbandry thing is where you've got multi-generations that you've caught the wild one and you've raised it well and you had it do the stud thing, and then the offspring that you get from it, instead of coming from the wild where you're only going to be able to get so much obedience out of it and get it trained to a certain point, you're now getting it from the youngest state possible where it's the most influenceable, and you can condition it to exactly the sort of roles that you need. So it seems like it would be, like a 1-2 sort of thing, that if you want to get properties from something out in the wild, you're going to get the wild version, but then you're going to want to start, taking care of it and trying to make stable and more tameable offspring from it.
We did get some clarification. So taming is under hunting. That was confirmed by Steven. I'm not sure where, but I don't understand that, because you can't max out both artisan paths, at least as far as we know it. So if you have these max level animals that you're breeding, like, how do you tame them? Or do they just automatically come tamed? I guess that would be the answer, is that you wouldn't have to tame them.
Well,
like tame is capturing, is what I.
Just because you're max level in one thing doesn't mean you're completely nothing in everything else. You're probably going to need to have some. Some of both skills. One of them will probably be a lot higher than the other, and that's what the one that you're specializing in. But I would imagine you're going to have at least a good enough level so you can get them to a point and then hand them over to a tamer to kind of take it over from there.
But if you're top tier, I mean, I guess I wouldn't expect that to be the case. like if you're producing top tier horses, but you're a low tier tamer, like how does that equate? I guess you just sell it.
Well, you're not. You're gonna have a big, strong horse that's not going to be very well behaved because you didn't train it very well. And it's going to kick someone, right in the soft parts, and you're going to get in trouble for it.
I think taming sounds more like capturing, not training. But
well, hearing this, I assume there's just going to be no taming aspect to animal husbandry, basically.
Right. I think taming is capturing, not training.
Okay.
Speaking real quick of Lord of the Rings Online, it reminds me that in the latest episode, this isn't technically
now I haven't
spoilers.
watched them all, so
yeah, but we know that things are crafted. We get to see some stuff crafted in the latest episode, and it just was, since we're playing Lord of the Rings Online, I was like, oh yeah, crafting is like an important part. I never really, when I think of Lord of the Rings, I don't think of, or even really necessarily Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not really thinking a lot of crafting, even though it's a key component of MMORPGs. So it was kind of cool to be watching the show and going, oh, there's a whole section where they're like crafting stuff. Just why I guess it is important in RPGs. So that's nice.
Woodchip mentions in chat, I think the restriction of specialization into only one artisan class will bite AOC in the ass. I agree. We've had this debate, Diggs and I. Usually it centers around dancing and whether I, in my late age, could ever learn enough dancing. Because my standpoint is my character should be able to learn anything as much as they want, but over time anyways. But I guess that's just where alts will come in, and maybe hiring of NPCs. I don't know if that'll be a thing or not to sort of help.
We're supposed to be helping each other out. We're doing that in Lord of the Rings Online a little bit. So that's what friends are for.
It's actually something that I think is going to be an emphasis, is not just people who have specialized, but specialized in different ways. It could be that one person that you're friends with is specialized in training for riding and going fast and staying steady and not being distracted when they're taking hits, while the other one's better at training for just combat and wearing armors and stuff like that. And so you've got two people that can train animals in different ways. So if you've got someone that's an expert horse trainer or whatever, and you're trying to make a horse that is just never going to let up, you get on that horse, you start riding, so long as you're holding W, you're going to get to where you're going. You get knocked unconscious on that horse, it knows where it's going. It's going to keep on going. That's the sort of magnitude of training you want for the horse. Likewise, you could do that. You could get the combat training for the horse, but if you want a combat mount, maybe you want a bear. You train up a bear mount. You train it to be ferocious. You train it to, just be a real unit that you can just stand side by side. You don't even have to ride it. It's a badass. And so that's where I could see there being the reason why you don't just have one, specialist who but the people who are the specialists in the adjacent skills on the server, and hopefully develop a good relationship with them so you can work together and, make the best stuff.
Yeah. The other thing that came up during this conversation actually wasn't even asked about. He just sort of threw it out there, was this idea of active crafting. The example he gave was hitting a sword, I think it was, actually pounding the sword, and that your ability to do so would influence the outcome, which has caused a lot of questions on the forums. I was commenting before we went live. Usually you don't see crafting questions on the forums. It's all PvP, combat sort of stuff. There's multiple threads right now about active crafting. What does that mean? Does it, my initial thought is every game I have ever played that had some sort of attempt at skill or memorizing a pattern in a way to get around this sort of button mashing just didn't work long term. it might have been neat to start with, but eventually it just gets very tedious and is just something where you're like, I wish I had a button that I could just press it, it'd count down to 5, and I would just wait 5 seconds. And I hope that they come up with something that is different, but I'm not so sure. I'm left in my mind thinking, well, what could you even do? Some of these threads are like, it shouldn't be based on dexterity, and it needs to be accessible by all. It's like, okay, I understand that. You have players that might have some sort of disability or something that won't let them do that. But then what's left? Like, how do you even implement active crafting if it's not trying to time a strike correctly?
Pretty sure Vanguard had a puzzle system where there wasn't a time ticking down, but you had a puzzle sort of system to it where you were making each of the components and sanding them down. And when something gets chipped, you have to glue it back together, and that takes a little of your stuff. And then as you would do things differently, you would gain skill or like the sub skills in different areas. For example, if you always shoot like way too high and you're constantly breaking stuff and having to repair it, you're actually going to get better at the repair skill. And so you would, that aspect of crafting, you would get a lot better at. I want to say EverQuest 2 has something like that, but I never tried their crafting system, so I couldn't really tell you.
EverQuest 2 was more just a mini game. It wasn't necessarily related to
watching.
So
statuses and responding appropriately.
Okay, so Vanguard, I liked a little bit of that sort of modularity to the crafting too. That you weren't coming in saying I'm making a staff of blank. It's you're making a staff of maybe a certain type, but then you're putting whatever elements and components on to derive the attributes that it's going to have. Which is funny because I got world first for making like staffs with strength and dexterity because those attributes didn't correlate with staff use. It's like, haha, angle shooting. I'm gonna get some world first on things nobody makes. But I think the other thing that's a big concern for people is the time commitment of it. Bang each item out is going to take a while. Even if you're able to do it perfectly every time, the fact that it's going to have that sitting down and doing it and having to focus, I can see how that could be a little cumbersome. There's the challenge of, making it difficult or fun, making sure everything is well explained, making sure the complexity and the user experience is good. And that can be kind of hard if you're trying to make something where, the player input really matters on the final result. And then, of course, that issue of like player skill versus character skill. Now, that's a thing in the game. Obviously, you aren't just standing toe to toe with someone on auto attack and seeing how the battle resolves. It's both your skill and, your character's approximately everything that kind of drives your ability to succeed in combat. So likewise, I can see how maybe they're trying to do that with the crafting as well, where there's some amount of, using both the character skill and the player skill. And the argument would be, oh, well, if you don't have, great manual dexterity and that's why you can't do the blacksmithing puzzle, well, sorry, if you don't have great manual dexterity and you're crappy in combat, we're not going to, help you with that either. So I could see, but go ahead.
This is an RPG, and RPGs are about character prowess, not player prowess. You're playing a character, and you should be able to build a character that is better at stuff than you are in real life. So you should be able to build a character that is maximally dexterous in a way that you are not as a player. That's the whole point of an RPG.
So that I wouldn't even be the one swinging the hammer on the thing. The character's already doing it for me.
That should be more important than the player skill, ultimately.
I think about like what Chronicles of Illyria, which I don't think is necessarily the game to not be mentioned anymore slightly for a moment, as they've maybe kind of come out from a long eclipse, maybe not. We'll see. Good, congrats on the thing so far. But anyway, the way that the crafting system, the whole verisimilitude over veracity that they were trying to do with that, where explaining how a sword blade would be crafted. You would start with your raw bar, your prefabricated and shaped bar that you were going to work with. You would have the final completed correct version. You would have maybe one or multiple failure states, and through the actions that you take, it would blend shapes through the different anchor points and through the weighting of it to either get towards the more correct one or some of the more incorrect ones. And what you ended up with at the very end, it would then convert into a mesh, and that's the real world physical, in-game item that you're going to see getting attached to a hilt and some person swinging around. So, whether that was going to manifest, who knows, but that was definitely the goal for it. And I do like, that consideration for it. But is that necessarily right for Ashes of Creation? I would be willing to split the difference and have something where you have to do the skill part to increase the quality by which you can make an item that you're going to be making a bunch of. You don't make the copper dagger 50 times. You make it maybe once or twice by hand, and then you run it out automatically 20 times. And now that you've gained more character skill, when you go back through and do the little mini game where you're banging it out yourself, the results are a lot better. The hammer strikes give you more of the transformations that you want. It automatically avoids mistakes better for you. And so, now you can craft a copper dagger better than you could before. And now the baseline quality that you craft when you just say auto craft it has now increased.
I really enjoy the crafting in Valheim. I'm not sure that it works well for Valheim, but it's more of a survival game than an RPG, and I'm not sure that really fits well with an RPG. But it was satisfying in that I felt like I was actually crafting items, and that's what I hope to feel in an RPG, is that whatever it is, whatever that process is, that again in EQ2 you were just pressing buttons. When I was pressing buttons to tailor stuff or make jewelry, it did not feel like I was actually sewing anything or really weaving anything. But I did feel like that in Valheim.
I'm not opposed to this idea. I would say, though, that it shouldn't be a limiting factor in crafting base items. It should be a step beyond the base weapon, right? So everyone that has a certain skill can make, some iron sword, but someone who has better active skills might be able to add something to that beyond what somebody else can. So instead of a +8 sword, you get a +10 strength sword or something like that. Now, I also, though, would say that as you improve as a character, and this gets back to the less RNG, the better. I think as a crafter in a role-playing game, the more skilled you get, the less randomness there should be, and the more directed outcome you should have. So I would also, though, say this mini game or whatever it might be should be harder in the earlier stages, less difficult in the later stages. Unless you're talking about sort of legendary, above and beyond board type of creations. The more iron swords you make, the less difficulty it should be, whether it's a dexterity check or something else that you're having to do. And that kind of gets into the idea of the character versus the player, as your character improves.
It seems to me too, though, that we should be able to put skill points into that, right? So, if we can do that with our weapons and abilities, I don't know why we wouldn't be able to do that with crafting.
I would much rather have free-form crafting than I would rather them, instead of spending the time in an acting crafted method, actually just create some sort of system that allows us to discover new recipes and kind of that they didn't expect to happen. I would much rather have that than an active crafting system. Like I would rather create some brand new coffee bean that they didn't know existed with stats they didn't know were possible than, somehow master the hammer swing to make sure the blade's as flat as it could be.
Well, I'm interested to see what it's going to be like. I don't have an idea based on what Steven said. It didn't really tell me very much. I will say that whatever they had in Alpha 1, I did not enjoy. It was kind of similar to Valheim in that you would go from the stove or the furnace to other maybe you're going from the furnace to the anvil, but then I could never remember all of the components. I think the recipes that you would need, I could never remember how many of this do I need to make in order to be prepared for that. So I was constantly going back and saying, oh yeah, I've got to make 6 more of these things before I can make 5 of these things. So whatever they do, fix that part.
Well, the last thing, we're about out of time. I wanted to kind of briefly go over, because I thought it was actually kind of cool and I hadn't heard of it before, was the idea of sort of ruins diving, so that when a node is sieged successfully or gets destroyed, the question was whether it was a siege or atrophy. I think he just mentioned being destroyed, so I'm not sure atrophy would be the same way. But
I want to jump in. I want to jump in real quick, because I think that question was more about whether or not when you rebuild that area, whether or not there will be ruins and you can still see aspects of the previous as you're rebuilding
Tales of the Town,
the new version. Yeah. So for instance, if that was an elven town, will you have elven remnant ruins of elven architecture, even though the new city there in that location is Nakua? So I think that's what the question was kind of getting at, and I don't think the answer really answered the question. But go ahead.
No, it did not answer that, but it did mention in sort of opt-in PvP process that sounded pretty interesting, that you could go into these ruins. These ruins would then have treasures of different types, essentially tied to whatever type of node it was, whatever their projects were that they had going, whatever their warehouses contained, and that you would basically fight it out either within the ruins or afterwards to obtaining these items, which sounded kind of interesting. I'm glad it's an opt-in. It also
What does opt-in mean?
Well, I assume there's going to be a magical line that you cross, and once you do, you're PvP flagged.
I don't consider that opt-in, but okay.
But and that also gives time for the other nodes to sort of build up before this node resets and has the potential to come back to life. Just sounded like an interesting take. I thought it was pretty neat. Aside from what you mentioned, Diggs. I also wonder how much, my fear has always been my freehold, right? If we lose the node siege and they have, it's up for grabs to whoever wants to come run it over. It's like, well, okay, well, maybe they're going to go fight over the ruins of the actual area rather than my freehold, and I'll have a little bit more time.
Maybe. It'll be interesting to see how it all manifests and at what stage they'll even have all of that. Did they say that was going to be an Alpha 2 thing, or did they say that, did he not actually give a specific time when that's going to be implemented? Because that very well could be a thing that doesn't make it into Alpha 2.
That is a good question. I am reading his response, and it mentions nothing on Alpha 2. Because he also mentioned you'll have to actually dig up the treasures. So it will take time to dig them up. I don't know if we'll have to have special tools other than just a shovel.
Yes, let's attack this height map with a shovel.
I think someone mentioned earlier something about complicating things a little bit in chat.
Yeah, I could see there being like, you're going along in the area and then you see this like outcropping that's very clearly a blocked passage towards like some ruins or something. So you got to go there and you break it down, and the process is loud and other people can hear, oh, someone's trying to break a rock down. Maybe I can follow them in and get a little piece of the action. So yeah, that could be a thing. That yeah, it's a way to make sure that it's not just a sneaky sort of thing that everybody knows. If you're having to use some dynamite to blow a passage open to try to get the delicious loot inside, that'll raise some attention.
I like it too because I feel like it gives another reason for people to declare and attack nodes, right? To siege a node. Before we're sort of relying on this idea of, well, you implemented taxes and I don't like it. Well, you have access to the mithril and I want it. You're doing something wrong that I want to be different, which I just felt like over 2 years, like, how long does that actually stay a motivator if everyone just generally is happy versus this, there's actually a reward at the end of the siege. You depending on what's made available, I would hope it's actually quite worth your time. And that just gives more motivation to sieging nodes.
It's a funny sort of thing now that I think about it, the idea of trying to help facilitate a place getting attacked so that way you can try to get specific loot. I could see like religious metropolis that's like, oh, that tier 5, a little ways down the way, why they have the Shroud of Turin. We want the Shroud of Turin. Who do they think they are, being the religious node with such a relic of such mighty power? So they help facilitate things to lead to that place getting knocked over. So they've then got their army waiting in the wings. It's like, all right, place has been knocked over. Let's go in and grab that relic. Like that's something I'm actually really interested in seeing. Like that level of machinations to try to get the relics and the very specialized sorts of things that will kind of be enshrined in different locations as long as they can hold them.
Yeah, someone was talking about this as a change, and I think the change is more the duration. We already knew that there would be a period of time where freeholds can be looted. And I don't think the time of that was stated. So it seems like it's not a super big change to what we've been told before. Just that the duration, it might last for several days. And someone in the forums kind of tagged me as if, hey, there's more PvP, you won't like it. And I'm kind of okay with temporary PvP zones that are going to last a couple of days. If I don't want to go there during that couple of days, I don't have to go there. I'm going to want to go there sometime. And when I do, I'm going to want it to be regular flagging system. But temporary PvP zone, I'm cool there. I don't have to be in a place 24/7, 7 days a week. And probably won't be. So
there's one more question I wanted to fit in real quick because I thought the answer was very interesting and I didn't think about it before. And it's one of these things that's sort of a consequence of nodes and node destruction. Was this, the question was, what is the intended leveling progression experience? And we sort of get into this, like we're all basically having a similar, in WoW, you have the same leveling experience basically now as you would a year ago. And the answer was, well, when the server starts, your leveling experience is actually going to be very different than a year from now. Just even considering things like fast travel, flight, like your ability to get around will be severely limited, the first several months that the servers are open. And I just thought that was interesting of an answer, that how someone experiences their leveling a year from release will be very different than we do at the start. I hadn't even considered that as an idea.
Oh, I totally figured that was going to be a thing. I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Part of his question, part of his answer, I wasn't, maybe, and this might have just been me being unaware. He talked about nodes having these road systems that connect each other. Mm-hmm. And that you'll be able to start from a building in one node and get on your mount and kind of fast travel, take the fastest route to the next. And I'm sort of thinking of the Lord of the Rings style of going from one stable to the other, where you're just sort of auto routed there. And I'm guessing that's how this will be as well.
Yeah, that's kind of what it sounds like.
Which makes me wonder how many people are going to pick you off. Like, do you just sit a little ways outside of the stable and you just wait? You don't do it right away, right? You wait, you give someone, a good 30 seconds on their journey to make sure they feel safe so that they go get a drink. And then you just come along and you pick them off.
It depends. Maybe you won't be able to. Maybe it's a very specialized form of transport that you're just moving too fast for anybody to be able to do anything to you. Maybe you're not even able to target it.
I mean,
why
we
wouldn't
have
you be?
combat.
It's the player in their own mount. You're not renting a mount.
Yeah.
He specifically
Yeah.
said your mount. And that your time will get faster as the node improves. They could spec into things from
That's
a node
true.
perspective, and your
That's
speed will get
true.
faster.
Well, then as they say in EVE Online, don't get on autopilot. You better stay there.
We have combat mounts, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But it may be that it's faster because there's no impediments. Like right? The road's going to take you through hills and easily help you navigate hills rather than you having to pick your own path. So that could be part of it, but we'll see.
So, yeah, I was reading that thinking, wow, we just now have a new system of highwaymen that just, going to pick off people, and I'm going to think I go to the bathroom real quick. It's going to take 20 seconds to get where I'm going. And the next thing you know, you're spawned somewhere when you come back. What the hell happened?
Well, I like how you mentioned new system, because it seems like we have a lot of new systems maybe. And anytime you have a new system or a significant change, that's going to add time to a release schedule.
Well, and of course, the easiest way to do this is to make the player invulnerable as they're using one building to the other. Of course, the next thing is that PvP crowd is going to be very vocal about, no, that should not be that's unfair. We should be able to kill whoever we want, whenever we want.
Okay, and then it could be like a limitations thing. It's like, okay, if you're only carrying like up to this much in your inventory, you're allowed to use it because we know you're not ferrying massive amounts of resources. But if you're carrying this much, we're not allowed to give you the invulnerability blessing because you're totally taking resources from point A to point B, and that's economic, and the magic doesn't work that way, so too bad. And that improvements in the thing is also how much more you can carry when you got invulnerable. Yeah. Who knows? Could also be maybe a place where you can hire a mercenary mounted people to just ride along with you. And so if you AFK out or whatever, or you go away and you get attacked, you've got some NPCs that are trying to help you. Or the hope is at least that, that person's got NPCs. Well, I'll just leave them alone.
Yeah. Because it's a good point. They could, I don't think they would make them invulnerable because you do circumvent the whole transportation of goods.
Again, we have combat mounts, so I'm expecting combat mounts to be something that you would use if you get attacked.
If it's an automated here to point A to point B system, I paid an NPC 60 silver. You feel like there should be some sort of, I mean, that's the sound of it. You're going to a building, you're asking to go somewhere, and they put you on the most direct path. It feels very much automated in the way he answered it. Otherwise, why is there a building? Like, why are you actually going?
You're just going to a place that has the Google Maps Varen transportation route app built in, and you're paying a fee to have it project the map thing for you, so you know the best route with the least traffic for the current moment.
Yeah, here's his answer. When they pop up, they create a connection. These are the ancient roadway systems. When they pop up, they create connection points to these arteries. These road arteries, essentially within the world, and the very basic building that you'll have access to, starting at a node village stage of 3, is to jump on one of your land mounts if you have a land mount, pay a fee, and take a faster route to a nearby node. And you can upgrade that at later stages, and it can become a flight path as well later on. So, I mean, it very much sounds like you're flagging an NPC and they're going to put you on a route. But I don't know. Interesting questions. This is why we need Alpha 2.
And my question is also about, is it a flight path? Are you getting on a something that's basically on a track where you're going to be invulnerable? Is it a shared dirigible where some other person might be on there that's going to try to stab you? What are all of the? Is it basically just a chute that blasts you way up in the air, and then some sort of gliding system with a homing device? So you just go way up, and then you.
So again,
glide down. What's the flying system going to be?
We don't have a lead game designer, so this is where I would prefer to have Jeffrey Bard around to say, okay, this is Steven's telling you what's in his head, and I might need to, curb some of those expectations that he's telling you, because, it sounds great in his head, but it might not work all that well in practicality. But, and also, again, hopefully a lead game designer would be telling him, okay, if we're going to do all that, I don't know when you think this game is going to release, but.
And I put a little reservation on a statement like that because we also have no idea how many of these ideas have already been stewing on the back burner, that there are things that they intended to do, they wanted to do, they wanted to make sure the tech was going to be right for it, they wanted to make sure thematically and everything else it was going to be right before actually saying, yay, we are actually going to provide this information on a system we fully intend to put in. So it could be that this isn't just, Steven going off on some sort of like wanting all the features mode, like, he doesn't know what's going on or anything, or that, not that he doesn't know what's going on, but like he's just shooting from the hip. I'm pretty sure all of this stuff is being filtered through a lot of decisions and a lot of design process, even if it's not through a lead, likely through production and potentially other folks. You don't think that. So, but
no.
There's no job posted.
Steven is kind of learning, but I don't think he's completely learned. And I think we still hear a lot of spin of, this is what I like to, this is what I want to do. And he doesn't have anybody telling him, okay, but practically that's gonna, there are caveats. You can't just do all the stuff that you want to do. I think he's had more time. And I'm sure they're talking about it. But I think just like we're going to release before 2020, he doesn't have anybody there telling him, yeah, that you want that to happen, but all this stuff, you have to have somebody. That's just been my experience working on games. You have to have a person strong enough to tell you, yeah, you want to do that and you think you can get that out. And maybe you could, but it's not going to happen in the time frame that you're thinking.
Well, last thing I want to say about this is I want to know the lore and how we have so many of these node connections, ancient roadways. I want to know how they still exist and are brought back, and how they exist in the places that they exist, since we're coming into an untouched world for many, many years. But I look forward to hearing that piece. And I see Omwa did not join us, so...
It's an invisible psychic fungus that interconnects through everything, and it can talk to itself in just very special ways. It's like the Super Mario Brothers movie, the original live action one, but instead of seeing the fungus everywhere, you don't.
Well, anything else before we wrap up for the night? Should we tell everyone we're going to go back to Theory Forge Chronicles? I'm just kidding. That's a joke. For those of you who didn't hear that followed us, the lawsuit is against them anyways, settled at this point in favor of Soulbound. So, it's interesting. So, And I believe we'll be here next week as well. Nobody has any plans to not be here. And we have, gosh, I think another 12, 13 questions to go over. So everyone have a great week. And thanks for joining us. And we will see you next Sunday.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.